name's Zoe Harcombe and I'm author of The Harcombe Diet. Today I'd like to do a short video on the difference between a saturated fat and an unsaturated fat, and to dispel some of the myths that are out there at the moment about the idea that saturated fat is bad for you and unsaturated fats are good for you, because this could not be further from the truth. On this flip chart here, and I hope you can see it okay, if not you could search for this on the internet very, very easily, the top diagram is chemically what the compound of a saturated fat is. Now, fat will always have this COOH at the end, which is just the terminology in chemistry for a fat. And then our saturated fat, which is this one up at the top, will have all these carbon atoms in the middle, and each carbon atom has 2 hydrogen atoms attached to it. So that is your saturated fat. Now, this is your unsaturated fat, chemically speaking, because let's get back to the basics of what actually is the difference between a saturated fat and an unsaturated fat. Still has the same COOH, so it's still part of the fat group, but it actually has this break in the middle here, where you can see that you've got 2 carbon atoms that don't have the hydrogen atom with them. And that's the only difference between a saturated fat and an unsaturated fat. So actually, the unsaturated fat is less stable. It has this bit in the middle where you've got the hydrogen atoms not paralleled with the carbon atoms as they are in the saturated fat. Now, the only unsaturated fats that we need to worry about are monounsaturated fats, where one bond is broken, and polyunsaturated fats, as in this case, where you've got more than one bond broken. So you've got more than one H missing. Now, this one just happens to be an omega-3 fat. Where the term fatty acid comes from, I don't know. Whether it's trying to make it sound sexier or healthier in some way, it's just a fat. And because this has the 3 units at the end, this one is called an omega-3 fat. But don't start thinking these are any better for you than any other fats, because as we're just about to see, nature puts fats in real foods in the proportions that you need it. So we're going to look at 3 foods today. We've got a natural olive oil, we've got some nice fresh pork chops here, and we've got, this isn't tuna, but if you can, come with me on this one, pretend that it is. And we're comparing 100 grams of each of these foods. Now, of course, being real animal foods, meat and fish are the only food groups that don't have any carbohydrate whatsoever. And olive oil also has no carbohydrate whatsoever because it is completely a fat. So none of them have any carbohydrate. Here's where it gets quite interesting, because olive oil also has no protein. It really is 100 grams out of 100, so 100% fat. Now, the protein in pork is pretty high at 22 grams in 100 grams, so 22%, and in tuna we've got 23% protein out of our 100 grams. Now, the fat content, look at that, because how interesting is this? How often are we told by things like the Food Standards Agency, the National Health Service, don't eat these fatty meats, and this one is great because it's still got the fat on, and this whole analysis is for a pork chop with the fat on. I'm trying to be as fair as possible here. So the olive oil, 100% fat, and only 7% fat for the pork, and 5% fat for the tuna. Now, here's where it gets really interesting, because on a previous VT, you'll have seen me saying that olive oil has got 6 times the saturated fat of pork, and here is how I'm able to say that. Because in the same 100 grams, there are 14 grams of saturated fat in olive oil, and only 2.4 in pork and 1.2 in tuna. The monounsaturated, yes, there are a lot of monounsaturated fats in our olive oil, but we've still got the saturated fat. We've also got polyunsaturated fat, those ones with lots of the bonds broken. So hopefully you can start to see that nature actually puts all the fats, saturated and unsaturated, within the saturated group. It puts in monounsaturated fats, polyunsaturated fats, omega fats, puts them all in real foods, but in no better or worse proportions, in just the proportions that they are needed. That's what nature does. Now, interestingly, our tuna is pretty much, if you break out the polyunsaturated fats into basic polyunsaturated fats and then the omegas, this one is practically 25% saturated, 25% monounsaturated, 25% polyunsaturated, and 25% omega fats. So it really is a balanced food in tuna, but that's where we get the number from, saying saturated fat in olive oil is 6 times higher than it is in your pork. Now, here's interesting, I can just raise this up slightly. In the data, you'll be able to analyse all of this online. If you go to the US Dietary Association, put in your own foods, do your own analysis of carbs, fats, proteins, highly recommend it. They will give you an overall nutrition score for each of the foods on there. And olive oil scores 5 out of 100. So this marvellous food, the source of the Mediterranean diet, scores 5 out of 100. The pork overall scores 36 out of 100. And the tuna overall scores 50 out of 100. And that will be on lots of things in terms of the fat content that's in there, the protein content, the nutrients, vitamins, minerals. Here's a very interesting one as well, because this is the overall amino acid score, and we need amino acids. It's an essential part of our diet. Clearly, not having any protein, olive oil has no amino acid score at all, whereas both the meat and the fish have 150 and 148. Only animal foods can even score over 100. All the vegetarian foods, the beans and pulses, score way less than 100 because they're not complete proteins. So the foods that we should be eating are real fats, real proteins in the form that nature delivers them. And there's just one more food group to talk about, and that's dairy products, because a lot of dietitians will say, oh, well, have the low-fat versions of the dairy products, and then you're cutting a lot of saturated fat out of your diet. Yes, you would be, but why do we need to cut saturated fat out of our diet? It's an essential nutrient that our bodies require. Nature very sensibly delivers fat-soluble vitamins in dairy products. So the vitamins A, D, E and K, the fat-soluble ones, are very prevalent in dairy products. So nature very sensibly puts fat in with fat-soluble vitamins so that you've got the delivery mechanism to get the vitamins absorbed by the body. Humans, incredibly stupidly, then take the fat out and therefore take out the delivery mechanism for the key nutrients in dairy products. So it's your call. If you want to go for the low-fat versions, that's up to you. Personally, I would not compromise on taste, and I would not compromise on my nutrients, and I will always go for the full-fat version. Hope you found this interesting. You now know where the statistic on olive oil and pork comes from, and of course the idea that monounsaturated fat is the primary fat in all of these foods that we've just looked at. Thanks very much for watching.